So, good morning. I'm Sonia Lucarelli from the University of Bologna, and I'm very, very pleased to chair this roundtable. It's a roundtable on the future of European security. I have a stellar panel that I will introduce in a moment. Let me just briefly say a few other things that I do. The event has been organized in the context of a series of seminars on international politics in the post-pandemic world that I have organized with Professor Michela Ceccorulli at the University of Bologna Forlì campus. The event is also co-organized with Punto Europa in Forlì, and I wish to thank Punto Europa for the effort, and in particular Professor Lasky and Dr. Casini. The topic is, I think, crucial. European security has been transformed significantly in the past, I would say, 30 years in terms of challenges, sectors, perceptions of what represents a security threat. And this has occurred, I believe, in at least due to three fundamental interconnected elements. One, it's critical junctures, so moments of transformation, the first of which having been the end of the Cold War, but then 9/11, the 20s, the 2000s crisis, have represented moments of transformation or potential transformation that have been captured by different actors. The second element is processes of adaptations of the existent international institutions and actors, adaptation and transformation. The case of NATO and the European Union are particularly relevant, and those are two of the actors that we will talk about in this roundtable. And the third one is socio-economic and political transformations within our societies that have transformed our societies in such a way that challenges, if not threat, can emerge also within societies. And this is another aspect that we will tackle. So the interaction between domestic, international, regional elements and levels is very important into the analysis of security in Europe. COVID-19 has accelerated, I believe, a series of processes that were already in place. And for a certain moment, for a long time, being in lockdown, we know it, our attention has been captured by the health security element. But in fact, the implications are much broader than that. So what we are here to do is explore the transformation of European security, look at the current trends, and also look at the possible future scenarios. To do so, we have really a fantastic panel of scholars. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Professor Andrew Cottey, he is EU Jean Monnet Chair in European Political Integration at the Department of Government and Politics at University College Cork. He teaches and researches in international relations and international security. He's well known to my students of pan-European security because I use a lot of his writing, and in particular, his book, Security in the 21st Century, that, as far as I know, is going to be republished in the third edition soon. We are looking forward to that. Rosa Balfour is director of Carnegie Europe and a long time friend of mine, and I have seen she has done a fantastic career into think tanks and academia, and she has been working thoroughly on European foreign policy in particular, also on European security. And prior to Carnegie Europe, she has been senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She also has published widely on many topics of our interest. I mean, in terms of the course within which this specific roundtable takes place, as far as European foreign policy, security, and in terms of area of interest, Mediterranean region and the Balkans. Joe Burton, Professor Burton, is senior lecturer in political science and public policy program and the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science. He's currently in this moment in Europe because he is a Marie Curie Fellow at ULB in Brussels, where he's working on a 2-year project on strategic culture and cyber warfare. And in fact, this is one of the areas of interest. He has been working thoroughly on cybersecurity, US foreign policy, NATO and transatlantic security, information warfare, technology, and international security. The last speaker that will join us very soon, being connected from the United States, is a quite early time for him, is Lorenzo Vidino. He's director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. He's an expert on Islamism in Europe and North America. He has held positions at Harvard University's Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs, at the Kennedy School of Government, and several other positions. He is really one of the most renowned experts on Islamism radicalization in Europe and North America. His most famous work, probably the most famous book, is The New Muslim Brotherhood in the West, published with Columbia University Press in 2010. Without taking any more time from what looks to be a very promising roundtable, I will immediately give the floor to Professor Cottey for a broad overview of European security, a topic on which he has worked so thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you to Sonia and Punto Europe for the invitation to this event. And I look forward to contributing to it and to hear what our other speakers have to say as well. So what I'll do is talk briefly about 4 things. Firstly, about the impact of COVID-19 itself in terms of international politics and European security. Secondly, a bit about the US. Thirdly, a bit about the European Union. And then fourthly, something about the West's relations with Russia and China. So if we start with COVID-19, my argument would be, and I think Sonia hinted at this in her introduction, that really it's accelerated some existing trends in international politics and European security rather than creating fundamental change itself. And I think probably when we look back in a few years' time, the COVID-19 pandemic will probably be viewed something like the 1918-1920 Spanish flu in terms of its impact on international politics, an important event, but not something that generated fundamental change. One way of thinking about this maybe is just to think about other comparable critical junctures or turning points. So 9/11, 1980, 1989, 1945. If we go back further in European history, 1848 or even 1648. And my broad point would be, I think that COVID-19 is not likely to have this kind of fundamental or structural impact. And if you think about this, perhaps one way is to look at 3 different areas. If you think about balance of power, domestic political change, or change to international institutions, and my argument would be that in each of those 3 areas, COVID-19 certainly so far has not had any kind of fundamental impact. So it hasn't radically shifted the balance of power. It hasn't led to radical domestic political change in a major actor, and it hasn't led to major changes in international institutions. And as quite a number of analysts have argued, I think, probably the way to think about the impact of COVID-19 is that it has accelerated some existing trends. And I'll come back to that point in my remarks in a few minutes. The second thing maybe we can think about in terms of the impact of COVID-19 is what you could call winners and losers. but perhaps more accurately, we should talk about how well different states and different actors have coped with the COVID-19 pandemic. One obvious point is a word of caution here. We're dealing with a very fast-moving situation. What seemed to be true 6 months ago looks quite different today. So it may be some time before we're really able to draw reliable conclusions about how different countries, different societies, different regions have coped with and responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I guess two sort of big headline points. One, there is an obvious case that China has arguably coped relatively well with the COVID-19 pandemic. The ability of the Chinese state to implement an relatively early stage, a very comprehensive lockdown has enabled the impact of COVID-19 in some ways in China to be limited, and also consequently reduce the economic impact in China as well. In contrast, obviously, there are arguments that the United States and quite a number of European states have coped less well with the COVID-19 crisis. So they've struggled with, if you like, back forth, on-off lockdowns, the scale of death, unfortunately, and human suffering, and the economic consequences as well. Having said all of that, my view would be that we probably shouldn't exaggerate the long-term significance of this in terms of our thinking about the status, stability, resilience, if you like, of different societies. So my guess is that probably 5 years from now, COVID-19 will not have dramatically altered our perceptions of different states or of their positions in the international system. That's something we can return to perhaps in questions and discussion. Second thing then, I'll say a little bit about is the United States. And here I want to make quite a specific point. And again, it may be one that we want to come back to in discussion. I would argue that COVID-19 has had a rather specific and contingent, but perhaps very important impact on US politics. If we look back a year ago, or just a bit more than a year ago, in early 2020, the US economy was growing quite rapidly. Many observers predicted that Donald Trump would likely win the November 2020 US presidential election. And I would argue that COVID-19 can perhaps be viewed, and the consequent economic crisis can perhaps be viewed really as the midwife, in a sense, of both Joe Biden's victory in the US presidential election, and also of the Biden administration's really quite radical economic policies. As many observers are pointing out, the Biden administration has been able to do things which only 2 years ago perhaps might have seemed politically and economically impossible. Obviously, the long-term impact of this remains to be seen. The second point I would make about the US in this context is really that perhaps the most important developments in US politics, particularly maybe from a European perspective and perhaps from a global perspective, may actually be on the right of the US politics. So what happens to the Republican Party now in the wake of Donald Trump's election defeat? Will the Republican Party become, if you like, a fully fledged nationalist isolationist party, or will it return to being a more mainstream centre-right internationalist party? And certainly from my perspective, I think quite a lot in terms of the future of transatlantic relations, the future of NATO from a medium-term perspective may actually depend on that question. Third thing then is just to say a little bit about the European Union. And obviously there's been quite a lot of debate about whether the European Union has had a bad or a good crisis in terms of its response to COVID-19. And at various points, I think there certainly have been legitimate criticisms of the European Union and things that the European Union has got wrong in terms of its response to COVID-19. But one point I would make is that if you look at the vaccine question, arguably the centralized purchasing of vaccines by the European Union has headed off what could have been quite a nasty competitive race to gain control of vaccines in the absence of all of that. So my assessment of the European Union's response to the COVID-19 crisis would perhaps be like many things, that it's somewhere in the middle. The European Union hasn't failed completely. It hasn't had overwhelming success, as I say. Perhaps the assessment is somewhere in the middle. The second thing I would say is that probably the biggest long-term impact of COVID-19 on the European Union has actually been in the area of economics. And of course, as is well known, the combination of the European Union's new budget, so the 2021-27 multi-annual financial framework, plus the stimulus package, Next Generation EU, that adds up to something like 1.8 trillion euros. And this is really very major. So this is significant in terms of the EU's economic policies and its response to the COVID-19 crisis. The other point, again, which many observers point out, is that there's also been a fairly significant shift in the EU's approach to conditionality around the use of this aid. So in a sense, there's been a shift away from, if you like, German ordoliberalism to a more flexible, perhaps Keynesian approach to how the EU will actually make use and make this funding available. Of course, we have to see how all this will play out. We're still at a very early stage in the economic stimulus program of the EU, and some of the details of implementation are still being worked out. But if the EU's program is even partly successful, this will be, I think, an important point in European economic policy, and perhaps could restore an element of renewed faith in the broader European project. I won't say anything about the impact of COVID-19 on European foreign policy as such, because I think that's less clear cut, but it might be something which we will return to in discussion. Then finally, my fourth point, which is about the West's and Europe's relations with Russia and China. And my headline point here is simply what I would term two new Cold Wars. For a number of years now, observers have been describing the West's relationships with both Russia and China as new Cold Wars or emerging Cold Wars. And my argument here would really be that the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced this dynamic. And I would argue this really in two ways. Firstly, if you look at Chinese and Russian vaccine diplomacy and Chinese and Russian disinformation efforts in the context of COVID-19, I would argue that these have really reinforced a sense that neither China nor Russia can be reliable partners for Europe. Secondly, also, particularly on the Chinese side, but perhaps also on the Russian side, the relative success, if you like, of China and maybe Russia, although now that's under question, of their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think this has strengthened a sense of what I would describe as aggressive self-confidence in Chinese and Russian politics and foreign policy. So I would argue really that COVID-19 has reinforced this trend towards what I call the two new Cold Wars with both Russia and China, reinforces the need for a united European response, and also from a European perspective reinforces the need to cooperate with the US vis-a-vis both China and Russia. So if I try and sum all of that up, clearly COVID-19 has had a very major impact in terms of human lives and society. And of course, we're all acutely aware of this in our everyday lives. And human suffering for many people. But actually, in terms of international politics, my argument would be that COVID-19 hasn't had the same kind of dramatic impact. And I suggest that perhaps when we look back on COVID-19 in maybe 5 years' time, we probably won't view it in quite the same transformative way as we certainly do, let's say, the 1989 end of the Cold War, or perhaps even 9/11. So I suppose, in a sense, I would argue that perhaps European security in 2024 or 2025 will not look radically different from European security in 2019 or early 2020. At the same time, as I've pointed out, perhaps three things I think where COVID-19 has had a very important impact. One, arguably, it's been, as I put it, the midwife of the Biden administration and a consequent upturn, at least certainly in the short term, in transatlantic relations. It's led to a new phase in EU economic policy making, which is very important. And then finally, as I've suggested, it's reinforced the trend towards these two new Cold Wars with both Russia and China. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers and to contributing to the discussion and the questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think it has been very important to underline that not everything changes necessarily every time that we have something that is shocking for us at the moment. However, starting from precisely from what you were suggesting, that is a strengthening of the two Cold Wars, I mean, tensions with Russia and China. This gives me the opportunity to address directly the question that I had in mind, in the back of my mind, when I invited Rosa Balfour. Rosa has worked a lot on European foreign policy and Brexit in European foreign policy. So in terms of recent crises, and I have mentioned a number of crises, but I didn't mention Brexit, that, however, on the contrary, it has been very important in Europe, it continues to be very important, and is also one of the factors that might have weakened the European Union capability to respond to what Andrew Cottey was referring to as the two Cold Wars with respect to Russia and China. So more broadly and more in general, what is your assessment of the impact of Brexit on European Union foreign policy and more broadly on European security, that is the ability of the European Union to procure this security? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. Very good question, and I have to say, in light of events, I have spent some time this morning wondering whether the European response to the hijacking of the Ryanair flight by Belarus, whether it would have been different with or without the UK. And I think this episode. It all, just trying to reflect on this also made me realize, first of all, that my voice in Brussels, because I'm based in Brussels, is a slightly lonely voice in arguing that actually Brexit harms the EU's ability to carry out foreign policy. In Brussels, there's a lot of, there's a strong belief that the EU will be able to move forward unhindered by an awkward partner such as Britain, but also how much emotions have been playing into the UK-EU relationship. And this has been very evident throughout 2021. So basically from the moment in which the UK-EU trade deal came into force, politics has been very much governed by emotions. And possibly also given, I'm actually half British, I also need to admit that there's a possibility that my own interpretation of what is happening is informed by a sort of bias as someone who, as a British citizen, enjoyed Britain being part of the EU. But I do think that Britain has contributed to EU foreign policy making. in the past, and I will that'll be one of the points that I want to make, just how and in what ways. And secondly, what has happened since the British departure from the European Union. It has altered the relationships, the balance of power. Actually, I had written down the term before Andrew Cottey used it, so it's nice to be able to use that. We're in sync in terms of what type of language we're using. The balance of power within the EU has changed with the departure of Britain, and I don't think we're yet seeing what new arrangements will emerge, but we are beginning to see some of them, and that these will have an impact on foreign policy. So let's just start briefly with the contribution of the EU, of Britain to EU foreign policy, just with a couple of perhaps backgrounds, based sort of statements upon which I will build my argument about Britain. We all know that EU foreign policy, foreign and security policy, is governed by unanimity. We all know how hard it is for the member states to reach a common position, and historically that common position has often been informed by the minimum common denominator among the EU 28, now 27. This makes EU foreign policy an area for horse trading, for bargaining, for all sorts of deals and discussions among the member states, of which we are not necessarily fully informed because they happen behind closed doors. But it does mean that member states have approached the EU with the goal of getting something out of it. And there are different patterns that we've seen. There are countries that use the EU as a means to multiply a national interest. There are groups of countries that push forward a shared interest and impose it, shall we say, on others, but it's accepted because then there's some trade-off. So, for instance, the Mediterranean states back in the 1990s, when EU foreign policy had been recently approved through the Maastricht Treaty, the Mediterranean states pushed the EU to create a pan-European policy towards North Africa and the Middle East. That was called the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which might have been of limited interest to other countries. For instance, the Scandinavian countries, Sweden joined in 1995, but in return, they also pushed for a northern dimension and policies towards the Arctic. And, by bringing the other member states, which might have not had a direct interest in that particular geography or in that particular policy, by bringing them to that, it strengthens the weight of that policy. It means that resources are divided in order to address with a sort of degree of equanimity the various priorities that collectively the EU deems important. And Britain has also done this. Britain has been a strong advocate, for instance, of enlargement, sometimes not all for the right reasons. For many, it was a sort of camouflage of weakening and diluting EU integration, but it has championed, what is still considered the EU's most successful policy, that is enlargement to Central Europe after the end of the Cold War. It pushed for the acceptance of Turkey as a candidate country back in 2005, and also for enlargement to the Western Balkans. Now, these are all areas where Britain is very much engaged, as has been very much engaged as a matter of national foreign policy, and in Europeanizing those priorities, it has contributed to shaping EU foreign policy. Of course, Britain is also through a different format, the E3, the group of so that's France, Germany, and the UK, has played an important role also in the negotiations with Iran over the JCPOA, and it continues to do so even now that it has left the European Union. So there's a whole range of issues that Britain has brought to the EU and where it has been a constructive actor. I would also add international aid. The current government has made significant cuts to international aid, but the UK has been an important international donor, and one of the few countries that has actually had met before in the past the 0.7 of GDP standard for the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was, in fact, the only EU country that had met that target before leaving and before deciding to cut international aid. And therefore, Britain has also played an important role in shaping policies towards, countries further away, such as Africa, and which otherwise the EU might have not designed in that way. So it's been a shaper. It's been a shaper. In Brussels, a lot of officials argue that for the past 10 years or so, Britain has been playing a limited role. It is true, it has not been much of a policy shaper since 2010, 2011. 2011 perhaps is the most accurate date. But in the past, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, it was a big shaper. And this notwithstanding the fact that Britain, France and Germany diverged significantly on the US-led invasion of Iraq back in 2003. Part of this contribution also came in the form of people. Some of the best EU diplomats are British. Britain has invested in making sure it had good people in the right places. In fact, there still are British officials working in the External Action Service and in the other institutions. Some have managed to stay on. But so it has been quite a present actor. And, the EU institutions still need to come to terms with the departure of Britain. Also because the current British government, when negotiating with the EU, decided to keep any matter relating to foreign and security policy cooperation off the negotiating table. So basically, EU institutions, even though the External Action Service has a unit dedicated to relations with the UK, but until the negotiations were completed at the very end of 2020, nobody was allowed to start strategizing a new policy. So at the moment, the level of cooperation between the EU and the UK is minimal. And I think we've seen, the sort of the various, there have been some moments, bilateral moments, which were not very particularly edifying on both sides. Both the EU and the UK have been involved in diplomatic spats that have not helped anyone. There's one more point I'd like to make about, which goes a little bit deeper, about the British departure from the EU and how it affects the balance of power within the EU and the relationships among the member states. And this goes back to my question this morning: would Britain's presence at the table at the summit last night, would it have changed the policy response? The policy response from yesterday is pretty satisfying if compared to the expectations. The expectations yesterday in Brussels were that the EU would only just manage to fudge some kind of common position. In fact, it did find a common position. There was unanimity, unlike on the statements with respect to Israel and Palestine, and promises a set of sanctions. We'll see what it manages to do in terms of implementation. But one thing that is completely missing from the statements that have come out from the European Council is a more political statement with respect to Russia. Russia was the item on the agenda. Russia and the UK, by the way, were the two items on the agenda for last night's dinner. Obviously, the event, the hijacking of the plane changed the agenda somewhat. So the statements are pretty matter of fact on both the UK and on Russia. But there's no hint that the EU is considering Russia to be responsible or partly responsible or involved or in the know with respect to the hijacking of the plane. And of course, its generalized opinion is that Belarus would have not been able to do what it did without Russian support. So there's no hint of that. And I do wonder, had the UK been at the table, perhaps the UK would have insisted on stronger words with respect to Russia. And this brings me to the question of the balance of power. First of all, I mean, it's no surprise, France, Germany, and Britain were the three heavyweights in the EU, especially insofar as foreign policy is concerned, but not only in foreign policy. And in many respects, Britain, a country with a long history of global outreach and vision, often, in a way, provided a synthesis that alone France and Germany were not able to reach. A synthesis on foreign policy matters. And on Russia, the UK was somewhat more hawkish, or certainly than Germany or France, which have both entertained ambivalent relations with Russia, and have a whole set of interests which make the two countries quite interconnected with Russia, starting from energy and the defense sector. So Britain provided that synthesis that enabled the EU occasionally to find these formulas and build consensus. And the other thing that Britain provided was a bridge to Central Europe. We know, and to the more Atlanticist members of the European Union. And I think this is, again, another particularly important aspect. Central Europe, the countries that joined the EU back in 2004, some of them, in particular Poland and the Baltic states, have a very, very suspicious view of Russia. They do not trust Russia. They feel that security threatened. This event with the Belarusian plane will heighten that sense of insecurity, and the presence of a country such as Britain in the European Union provided some guarantees and assurances, both of the political and security weight of the European Union, and also of the connection with the United States and NATO, which for these countries is absolutely vital for their own perception of sovereignty, their perception of security. And Britain very much provided that bridge, which arguably now is less strong. There's a simultaneous challenge of rule of law in Poland, in Hungary, now in Slovenia as well, which puts European capitals at a degree of distance, not much, with respect to the governments in these countries. But more importantly, there's been a limited, especially in France, a limited understanding of the security predicament that these countries feel. And this has not helped the sense of solidarity and the sense of the need to build common positions, and has facilitated processes of fragmentation. Of course, the 4 years of Donald Trump have also emboldened some leaders in some countries, and they have been actively undermining EU foreign policy, merely for the sake of undermining European foreign policy and undermining the ability of the EU to act on the international stage. So it's not just a consequence of Brexit; it's also a consequence of other dynamics of fragmentation that are happening in the EU for other reasons. Or shall we say, there are multiple dynamics that can lead in the direction of fragmentation. I think I'll spend the next just couple of minutes looking forward a little bit and connecting also to a few of the things that Andrew Cottey was saying about about the transatlantic dimension in particular, this growing assertiveness and aggression of powers such as Russia and China, which are using a narrative of declinism, the decline of the West, and therefore we are emboldened to do more. And of course, I have been stoking also the decline of the West through interference and through several forms of interference. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about these in the future. Obviously, with the Biden administration, the opportunity for rethinking what the West is and the role of the transatlantic relationship within that framework, the opportunity is immense, and it is and it's complicated by the fact that Britain has left the EU. The fact that the dynamics between Britain and the EU are so embedded in ideology, especially on part of the British government, but also on the EU side, both sides, in fact, have a desire to prove that they were both right, that the EU works and that the UK works without the EU, and also by emotions. And this makes things a little complicated. I mean, there's several opportunities, forthcoming opportunities. There's COP26, we've seen the G7, G20, several opportunities to shift gear in the transatlantic relationship. And of course, these actions that Belarus or Russia, China pursue also gives an excuse for these countries to get together, but and to sort of try to halt this drift away from international rules and try to draw some red lines as to what can be done and what cannot be done. But it is the rethinking and reimagining the transatlantic relationship after Brexit is hampered by the bickering, by the bilateral bickering, and by the ideology and the emotions. So I think in the short term, the prospect really is for, at best, ad hoc cooperation without too much publicity, because the British government doesn't want to be seen as cooperating with Brussels. And it's going to be ad hoc, and it's likely to be at the level of individual alliances. Now, last night, the EU re-emphasized the need to maintain unity in the relationship with the UK, but I think on foreign policy we can safely assume that countries such as France and Germany will turn towards working with the UK when necessary, especially if that is a UK demand, as they have been doing on other issues as well. So I think the likelihood that because of the changing dynamics among the member states, because of the shifting balance of power, which still hasn't found its new focal point, the short-term likelihood is that on foreign and security policy, Europeans will be fragmenting further. And I'll end it there.
Thank you very much. Rosa has been also very interesting, and it opens up a series of questions and that I hope we will tackle in the Q&A. It definitely tells the story of a struggle that we have to play within the European Union in order to find ways of developing a dialogue with the United Kingdom that has not been that present in the Brexit negotiations on foreign policy and European security. There are several tables of cooperation which are indispensable, I think, for both the European Union countries and Britain. And so it's definitely an open issue that needs to be tackled. Although, I mean, the Brexit negotiations have been going on for so long, so lengthily, and the story is not finished, in the sense that a lot of things have to be settled. So without asking you anything at this point, because we will have a Q&A in the end, I profit of some of the things you have said to ask a question to Joe Burton. We are in a moment in which we have seen that on the one side, the European Union is weakened by the Brexit and the exit of the United Kingdom, in a moment in which China and Russia can profit also of some of what they can claim to have been gains and efficiencies in the pandemic. We have seen that they have not denied the use of cyber tools in order also during the pandemic. So this issue has been very present. And we also know that although in very different ways, both China and Russia do use quite a lot the opportunities provided by the digital age to interfere or to gain relevant information and strategic information through the digital platforms. So in this respect, my question is to you, how equipped we are, how ready we are to cope with this, what we can say with respect to readiness in terms of the more relevant security actors in the realms of cybersecurity in the transatlantic space. So I think, of course, particularly of NATO and the European Union. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sonia. And again, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and to hear from Andrew and Rosa. And I think what I'll say will really, I think, connect with some of the themes that they've raised already. And I agree wholeheartedly. I think China and Russia have become very adept at using cyber tools to advance their national self-interest in ways that have been ultimately harmful to European institutions, European societies, and European security. And I think you're also very right to mention the accentuation of these problems that have been caused by the COVID pandemic. In some ways, it's been a pandemic as well as an infodemic or a cyberdemic of fairly epic proportions in terms of cyber insecurity running in parallel with the broader insecurities that have been created by COVID. So yes, these are hugely pressing problems. And your question is, well, how well equipped are we to deal with that? Perhaps I might start by identifying some of what I think are the key challenges for European security in cyberspace, and then I'll talk about probably the EU's response for the most part in terms of its new strategy, which came out in December of last year, which is its key guiding document to respond to these challenges. And I'll talk a little bit about NATO at the end, and perhaps we can go further on the NATO discussion in the Q&A. So I would describe probably 5 key challenges that are presented to European security by cyber instability and cyber attacks. And I think it's a big topic, but I think these kind of 5 core challenges, I think, really get to the heart of some of the problems. Firstly, we have seen cybersecurity problems stemming from the COVID pandemic. We've seen, of course, many of us on this conference, and my fellow speakers will be familiar with the fact that we've been home working for the most part, a lot of us, for the last year or so. This has created a lot of issues in terms of protecting computer networks that are now much more distributed than they were before. According to recent EU research, some 40% of EU workers have switched to teleworking, remote working since the pandemic started. So this in itself creates cybersecurity challenges. Network administrators and cybersecurity professionals are now having to plan to protect much more distributed networks than they were doing before. And this has created a lot of work and a lot of problems. We've also seen the wave of kind of pharmaceutical espionage, hacking with a view to trying to find information about vaccine programs that European countries and others have been developing. So this has, I think, heightened and accentuated the amount of espionage and given it a new flavor, if you like. We've had increasing cyber attacks against the health sector, itself. Just this last week, one of the most serious cyber attacks ever affecting Ireland has taken place. And I just thought I'd read from, just very briefly, from an ABC News article, which really kind of puts this latest cyber attack against the healthcare system in Ireland in perspective. This is from an ABC News article. Staff coming into work at several Dublin hospitals on Friday, May the 14th, found an unsettling sight. Throughout the building, every computer screen was dark. It was the result of the massive ransomware attack that crippled Ireland's health services IT systems, and that has left most of the country's hospitals without computers for over a week. The outage has wreaked chaos, forcing the mass cancellation of routine appointments, blocking access to patients' records, hobbling testing and some key treatment services, including for cancer patients. So we're seeing this kind of wave, particularly around ransomware, which seems to be very much the kind of preferred tool of choice for cyber criminals at the moment, this wave of attacks against healthcare facilities. And I think that this presents a really serious problem that we need to find ways to deal with. And cyber attacks affecting the health sector have been taking place throughout Europe. So for these reasons, I think one of the key cybersecurity challenges at the moment is looking at this intersection between cybersecurity and the insecurity of our health sector and the problems around COVID. So that's the first challenge. I think, what's come out of what Andrew and Rosa have said, that there's also a challenge with respect to geopolitics and the EU's key relations with Russia, China, and particularly the United States. China, of course, has been recently linked to another major cyber attack against Microsoft, the Microsoft Exchange server hack. We've had another major breach of the US government, the SolarWinds hack, which used software that many US government institutions and private sector organizations were using in their systems to compromise the US government and the US private sector. This has been one of kind of the biggest cyber espionage operations in history and has severely compromised US government networks. And we've also seen, again, not just state actors like Russia and China using cyber attacks for geopolitical purposes, but also really a growth in cybercrime. And there's been this blurring of the distinction, if you like, between state and non-state actors in cyberspace. The rise of cyber criminals. Another major ransomware attack against the Colonial Pipeline US energy infrastructure, in which that company paid $90 million to the hackers to free up their systems from ransomware. And we know that countries like China and Russia are kind of outsourcing these operations, sponsoring cyber criminals sometimes to conduct these operations with a view to, again, extracting money from a wide degree of actors. So we're seeing, geopolitical challenges really changing. Yes, we've got US, Russia and China operating in this spaces, but we're also seeing this intersection between state actors and cyber criminal groups, which is really presenting a huge problem for Europe and its strategic partners. And coming off the back of 4 years of the Trump administration, unfortunately, I would say we haven't in Europe had a particularly strong ally in the United States around these issues over the last 4 years. I think things are probably improving as the Biden administration comes into office and begins to take cybersecurity more seriously. But we again had a president that ignored his own intelligence assessments from his own intelligence services about Russian hacking, who called on other states to hack into the email accounts of his political opponents, who fired one of his cybersecurity chiefs, Chris Krebs, for saying that there was no actual cyber interference in the 2020 election. And I think, unfortunately, Donald Trump's presidency was one which set a fairly awful precedent for cybersecurity cooperation and effective responses to malicious activity. Again, the trajectory of the Biden administration, I think, is positive so far on this, but there are some still quite, I think, deep-rooted cybersecurity issues that will continue to hamper transatlantic cooperation. The US is, of course, taking a much more offensive approach to cybersecurity through its persistent engagement and defending forward strategy. It's much more proactive, operating in adversary networks and indeed in allied networks to deter, disrupt cyber adversaries. And I think that presents perhaps a challenge for Europe, because sometimes the United States is going to be operating in European networks to do this, sometimes covertly, and there's a whole host of cooperation, intelligence sharing, consent issues that these sorts of strategies create. And we're seeing in Europe, I think, this renewed calls or new calls for digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy, which have a cyber and digital dimension. I think European policymakers are uneasy about our dependence on the United States, particularly the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, whoever it is. We want to be able to be more autonomous, to be less dependent on the United States. And I think that, while there are some positives coming from the Biden administration, some of these issues will continue to be problematic in the transatlantic alliance. So 5 key issues: the pandemic, geopolitics of cybersecurity. The third one, I think, is diplomatic challenges for European Union. And that obviously relates to Russia, China, and the US. But there are some broader diplomatic challenges, and I'm involved with Sonia in a new project on cyber diplomacy, and we're looking at how EU can craft its international relationships in this area. But there are some real, again, challenges for Europe in doing that. One of which I'll return to later is EU-NATO cooperation. How do these two institutions cooperate more closely with respect to cyber threats? NATO is, if you like, the military wing of the Atlantic Alliance, and we've got EU taking much more care of kind of regulation, economic aspects of cybersecurity. And I think that there's a real need to do so cohesively and collectively in a way that covers that kind of military to soft power spectrum and perspective. So this is, I think, a really important challenge for the EU. How do we cooperate with NATO more closely in taking these issues forward? We've also got interests at the United Nations, ongoing negotiations on cybercrime treaties at the United Nations, for example, through the governmental group of experts process and the open-ended working group. We're seeing, I think, a new form of multi-stakeholder cyber diplomacy emerge, where you've actually got the big tech companies that are quite active in this space, and European policymakers and cyber diplomats are not just negotiating with other states now, but negotiating with the tech sector itself in order to try and solve some of these cybersecurity problems. And wider issues around how do we promote in Europe our values in cyberspace through our cyber diplomacy? How do we try and protect this open and free internet that we all want to see? So pandemic challenges, geopolitical challenges, diplomatic challenges. I think we also face some really big economic and industrial challenges in this space too, which EU policymakers, I think, are struggling and grappling to deal with. One huge problem in the EU is really capacity and skills and the workforce. There are still really severe skills shortages in Europe in the cybersecurity market. According to the EU, there are 291,000 posts for cybersecurity professionals in Europe, which remain unfilled, vacant posts, which we need people for. So we've got to do things like education and training in cybersecurity much more intensively. There are wider economic industrial challenges in securing the cybersecurity supply chain. If we think about our devices, whether it's our mobile phones or our computers or particular software that we're using, that will not necessarily always come from a trusted supplier. It might be that the components in our systems which create vulnerabilities are sourced from around the globe, which means we've got to have much better relationships with key strategic partners to make sure that those components of digital infrastructure are secure. And again, these are wider global economic challenges for the EU that I think we're only starting to get to grips with. And I think in respect of economics and industrial challenges, I just don't think that there's been enough recognition of the fact that market dynamics are not particularly well suited to cybersecurity. What do we want? We want to be able to use the internet freely and openly. We don't want to have a million passwords passwords. We don't want to have two-factor or three-factor authentication. We want ease of use. That's the behavior that we like to have online. Unfortunately, that's just not compatible with cybersecurity anymore. And the other problem here is that the incentive for the companies, the producers of our computers, our laptops, our phones, and what have you, their incentive is to release products to the market in the most profitable way possible, to release them quickly, to make money. And unfortunately, they're just not concerned enough about the security of those devices. One of the latest iterations, for example, of the Apple iOS software, when it was released, was hacked by Chinese hackers in a national competition in a matter of hours. So it was broken into. So we're just not paying enough attention to these market dynamics in software and hardware development, and this in itself, this need or want to have ease of use with our devices and to make a profit and to have cheap computing is one of the major causes of cyber insecurity. And until we get to grips with that, I'm not so optimistic that progress is going to be made. And the fifth challenge, rather, that I'd like to just highlight is a technological one. Cyber technologies are evolving very rapidly. We have one of the big issues now is the proliferation of the Internet of Things, IoT devices. There's going to be 25 billion separate internet connected devices in the world by 2025. 25 billion. What's that? 3.5 devices for every single person on the planet, and 1/4 of those are going to be in Europe. So we're seeing this massive expanding Internet of Things, and again, a lot of these products are being released onto the market in ways that are just not secure. They don't have the adequate security in them, and this is why the EU really needs to be very proactive in driving standards for these devices and regulating this market to make sure that these devices at least have some semblance of security around them. The other technological challenge, I think, is other emerging technologies. Artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly important in the cyber domain, both for network defense, particularly situational awareness of what's happening on computer networks, but increasingly malicious actors, including states and non-state actors, are harnessing automated process to attack and subvert and exploit and degrade computer networks. There is AI out there that will harvest information from social media, pick out particular demographics and target people with malware based on their social media demographics in an automated way. So this is where the cutting edge of cybersecurity is, both in offense and defense. And again, the EU needs to be very proactive in adapting to this and really becoming an innovator in AI-enabled cyber defense. And of course, the other technological challenges exist relating to 5G, the implications of quantum computing and quantum encryption. This technological convergence between cyber, AI, IoT, 5G, quantum computing is really going to present a lot of challenges to European policymakers as we move forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So those are the kind of 5 challenges that I wanted to highlight. Again, a pandemic challenge, a geopolitical one, a diplomatic one, economic and industrial one, and a technological challenge. And that leaves the question, well, what is the EU doing about it? As Sonia said, how well equipped are we? I think my overall assessment would be actually, whilst there are lots of challenges, the EU is probably the world region, or the European area is the world region that's most advanced and the most sophisticated in looking at these issues. And I don't know whether we have the possibility to link, I'm just going to link the EU cybersecurity strategy in the chat, and maybe the moderators can post it on Facebook if there's a Facebook stream. I'd encourage you to have a look at this. This is the latest EU cybersecurity strategy, which came out at the end of 2020. And I think it's probably the most sophisticated, comprehensive strategy I've seen of any country or any regional organization. So it's really, I think, at the cutting edge, and the EU policymakers are aware of the challenges we have to deal with. It looks, I think, to make significant forward progress in addressing these complex cybersecurity challenges that I've been mentioning. It particularly mentions things like threats from devices, IoT, threats to the financial sector, banks, aircraft, public administration and hospitals. These are really at the top of the agenda for the cybersecurity strategy. And it also mentions, obviously, that cyber is one part of a broader group of hybrid threats that the European Union needs to take very seriously. Cyber attacks are happening alongside other coercive activities. You know, we've had the incident over the Ryanair flight. We've had a pattern of economic coercion that's happening, annexation of territory, covert cyber espionage. These are a part of a pattern of activity from the EU's adversaries, and the strategy rightly recognises that. And it's built around 3 pillars: resilience, technology and leadership, building operational capacity to prevent, deter, respond to cyber operations and malicious cyber attacks, and thirdly, advancing a global and open cyberspace. And I think those 3 key themes are important and encapsulate a lot of the problems that I've just described. But I think there's a lot of work to be done. And if I had to give my kind of critique of where the EU is at with this strategy, this concept of resilience, I think, is very prominent in cybersecurity debates, but it remains pretty ill-defined and hard to do. The basic idea is that you can create services and IT networks which respond and recover to cyber attacks quite quickly. You recognize that cyber breaches are going to occur, but it's about getting that functionality back up online again quickly in the event of cyber attacks. It's a defensive focus, and that's really been at the core of the cyber security strategy as far back as 2013. But I guess my argument will be, well, evidence shows that we're not particularly resilient to these types of operations at the moment. Look at the $90 million ransoms that are being paid for ransomware. Is that a sign of resilience? I think it's a sign that we're not particularly resilient to what cyber criminals and state actors are doing. So how do we really embed resilience and get better at protecting networks and recovering them? And ransomware perfectly exploits those things. The strategy talks about protecting free and fair elections from democratic processes. Again, that's been hugely important. We've seen particularly around, allegations around the Brexit debate about cyber subversion there, interference with the US election, and this being a wider and growing pattern. But it's hard to do that when we have a broader democratic backsliding in Europe. You know, how are we going to protect free and fair democratic election processes or show that we're serious about that when some countries are implementing quite liberal practices? The strategy, I think, uses some quite outdated rhetoric as well. Cyber shields. You'll see these kind of physical analogies which aren't particularly analogous to cyberspace. You can't put a shield in front of a computer network. It just doesn't work that way. So there are some kind of language and conceptualization issues around it. The strategy promised to build ultra-secure quantum networks that are encrypted, but what if adversaries deploy their own quantum machines that can break our quantum encryption? There's really, I think, probably going to be some kind of espionage or information arms race in this area around quantum. How do we deal with that? Controversies around 5G are quite prominent in the document, but those aren't resolved, I don't think. There are still some countries using Chinese suppliers for their 5G networks. We're going to see 6G come in probably the end of the decade, and we need to be very careful that we're not going to repeat the geopolitical controversies that we've had around 5G when we deal with those technologies. It mentions standards for IoT. How will they be enforced? What if people are bringing IoT from suppliers outside of Europe into Europe? Can we regulate IoT companies that are operating outside of Europe? That's going to be a huge challenge. And the strategy places a lot of emphasis on deterring cyber attacks. Yes, you can try and be resilient for them, and that might actually dissuade people from attacking you. But how else can we actually make the malicious actors think again about what they're doing? How can we convince Russia and China or criminal organizations that it's not worth their while to conduct these types of cyber attacks? So far, I guess the main approach has been EU sanctions on countries that are involved in these kinds of activities. But I think a lot of people feel that the sanctions regimes around cyber aren't particularly effective, and they aren't stopping these countries doing what they're doing. So this is an intractable debate, and it's been one that cybersecurity scholars have talked about for the last 10 or 15 years. How do we do cyber deterrence? the EU can talk a good game and put deterrence in their EU cyber strategy, but actually doing it is very hard, problematic. Let me just close by talking a little bit about NATO and the EU. Again, I think that there's a natural incentive for NATO and the EU to cooperate on these issues, which I think is really important. And one of the areas is, again, about how NATO and the EU themselves use offensive cyber capabilities to protect European interests. NATO's developed a framework where individual allies can lend their offensive cyber capabilities to the alliance to support NATO missions and operations. Voluntary sovereign effects, that they are called, that it's called. I think perhaps one of the issues for the EU, particularly in the CSDP context, is if you have a EU CSDP mission, you've got troops in the field on an operation, and you've got foreign adversaries, hackers trying to infiltrate your networks, trying to harm you. Is the EU going to develop some kind of capability to stop that happening by hacking back or by stopping those actors using computer networks in an offensive way? The EU, of course, historically, culturally, is very averse to any kind of militarization of its cyber capability and capacity, but I don't think it's going to be able to just say we can take an entirely defensive position when we're confronted with these sorts of operations on CSDP missions and contexts specifically. Happy to expand on NATO, because I've done a lot of work on NATO and cyber. I hope I've highlighted some of the main challenges, what the EU is doing in response. And as I say, my overall assessment is there's a lot of positive things to be said in this area, but equally a lot of work to be done as we go forward. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you. It has been very broad and very interesting panoramic. We usually tend to focus only on the fake news that are circulated on a few other things, but on the contrary, you have shown that the realm exposes to a series of challenges in different areas. And this reference that you made, and that is intrinsic in the topic of the resilience of societies and the difficulties of coping with challenges that come most frequently from the outside, but frequently with the support of internal actors. The case of Donald Trump you made the reference to is particularly telling. So this the interaction between the internal challenges and external challenges, this the difficulty of dividing really the realms of security helps me to create a bridge and a connection to the next speaker that I'm very glad to introduce. I have already introduced Professor Vidino, but I will now have the opportunity to give him the floor. He's, as I said before, an expert on extremism and radicalization. And this is one of the issues that I like very much to refer to in the course, to give really the idea that you cannot really talk about security only as something that comes from, as a form of protection of us from challenges that come from outside. And the reference to extremism and radicalization in our societies and the connection between this and external challenges from terrorism to others is a very important area of investigation when we talk about European security. So on these topics, I will immediately give the floor to Professor Vidino, and thanking you for very early wake up this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize for having missed the first part of the symposium. I'm an early riser, but not as extreme of an early riser. So again, I apologize to everybody, to my fellow panelists for having missed their talks. What I would like to do in the time that I have is give a general overview of the sort of state of the art, let's call it like that, or state of the threat when it comes to extremism, radicalization, terrorism in Europe at the current moment. But of course, to do that, I think it's useful to look at the last 10 years that have really been important in shaping the topic. And then after that, we maybe look a bit at the response and how European countries and the European Union has dealt with the issue and is going to deal with it in the foreseeable future. I will try to talk about all forms of extremism because, of course, in Europe, we do see a variety of extremist threats. If anybody picks up the annual report from Europol, one will find a very broad description of the different extremist ideologies, trends, and groups that exist and operate in Europe in different ways in different countries. But of course, we have ideologies that inspire extremists that range from, let's say, religiously motivated jihadist extremism to right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism, ethno-nationalism extremism, and so on and so forth. I will speak a bit more about religiously motivated extremism, partially because that's my main expertise, but also because it has been for the last, well, one could argue since 9/11, but definitely over the last decade, has been the main threat that has occupied the attention of authorities throughout Europe and also here in the United States. But it's important to also look a bit at the other trends that exist within extremism, and I think the growing threat posed by right-wing extremism is something we should definitely discuss, and I would like to devote a couple of minutes to that later on. So what's the status of the jihadist threat? Let's call it like that. That's the language that Europol uses. We are in a stage that is defined by most as sort of transitional. The previous decade saw an unprecedented mobilization triggered mostly by events that took place outside of Europe. Just to give the numbers, we saw some 5,000 individuals leave the continent to go and join ISIS and other groups in Syria and Iraq. And we saw some 70 terrorist attacks taking place on the continent, inspired by jihadist ideology. Now, of course, in these 70 attacks, you'll find some of the very big and lethal ones, like the ones in Paris in November 2015, the attacks in Nice, some very large ones, but also the smaller, number-wise, the most frequent ones, which have been the small attacks carried out by one isolated individual, often with a knife, those sort of semi-amateurish improvised attacks, which nonetheless have had an impact on the psyche and the policy of many European countries. So we come from a decade that has been largely characterized by that surge, and of course the years in which we saw the wave of foreign fighters leaving Europe, 2013, 14, were the years where we saw the largest mobilization, and then 15 and 16 were the years in which we saw the largest number of attacks taking place on European soil. Since then, we have seen a decline of both dynamics. Of course, traveling outside of Europe to join jihadist groups is not really an option anymore. With the, if not complete demise, but definitely the decline of ISIS and the loss of territorial control for the group in Syria and Iraq, there's no clear destination for individuals who want to join jihadist groups. There are, of course, other regions throughout the world where groups affiliated to ISIS or Al-Qaeda are active, and some foreign fighters are joining. But for a variety of reasons, none of these regions, none of these locales, none of these groups have the ability to attract the same size of mobilization that ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra did in 2004, 2015. There's a lot of concern among European policymakers for good reason about developments in sub-Saharan Africa, whether that means the Lake Chad basin, so Boko Haram from northern Nigeria and neighboring countries, developments in the DRC and Mozambique, with two local groups that have for a long time operated as simply local small insurgent groups that have recently fallen under the umbrella of ISIS and therefore consequently escalated their operations and their lethality. Some foreign fighters also from Europe have joined or tried to join these groups, but the numbers are very small. Nothing compares to what happened in started almost 10 years ago in terms of traveling to Syria. There's a logistical reason. It was very easy to go to Syria from Europe. It's very easy to cross the Turkish border and get into Syria. Well, it's very difficult to get to the areas I just mentioned. And also from an emotional point of view, the fights of these groups do not have the same kind of appeal that what ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra were disseminating, at least the kind of rhetoric that they used, and the fact that they were building something in the heart of the Arab world had an emotional impact that the DRC, Mozambique, cannot really have on people within the sort of jihadist community. So there are many features in the mobilization that just came to an end, and of course these are important because they're not gone. Even though, of course, as we said, ISIS is no longer the magnetic force that was 10 years ago. Even though the number of attacks has gone down, there is still very much a jihadist scene in Europe. Of course, dynamics change from country to country. I think that's one of the main lessons that we have seen, is that dynamics of radicalization are very much local. We have seen, for example, that countries in Central and Northern Europe have seen a much larger mobilization and much higher levels of radicalization compared to the Southern European countries, which has been puzzling for some because of the at times unclear relation between integration or lack of integration and radicalization. So countries where in theory integration works better, such as the Scandinavian countries, for example, have seen higher levels of radicalization than countries like Italy or Spain, where I think no matter what the standards used to judge integration, things are not as good as in Central Northern Europe. We have seen an enormous diversity in the individuals attracted to jihadist ideology. There's absolutely no such thing as a common profile of an individual that is attracted by jihadist ideology. And you can actually apply that to any kind of extremist ideology. So men and women, teenagers and individuals in their 60s, people who are seemingly well integrated, and individuals at the fringes of society. So absolutely impossible to profile, but we have seen obviously statistically insignificant percentage of the European Muslim community, but relevant from a security point of view, radicalize and embrace this ideology. We're now in this transitional phase because, as I said, there's no longer a magnetic pole that ISIS and the caliphate, or its self-declared caliphate, exercised a few years ago. So there is this bubble of sympathy, which has perhaps decreased in size, but it's obviously not gone. It has not evaporated, and it sort of lacks a direction. We have seen that several of the attacks that we have seen over the last couple of years have been carried out by the so-called frustrated fighters, frustrated travelers, people who tried to travel abroad and join jihadist groups, couldn't, and then carried out an attack in their countries in which they lived. That is the dynamic, for example, of the November 2nd attack in Vienna last year. Somebody who tried to go to Syria and Iraq a bit late in the game, got arrested, sent back to Austria, served a short time in prison, once released, carried out an attack in Vienna. And this leads me to a bit of the legacy of the recent mobilization that we do see currently in Europe. And what do I mean by legacy? We see, first of all, a relatively large prison population linked to the previous mobilizations. The number of arrests of individuals linked to jihadist ideology were extremely high in the 2014 to 2018 years. Most of these people were sentenced to relatively short time to be served in prison. So now we have, again, dynamics change from country to country, a relatively large bulk of people who are, first of all, in prison and potentially radicalizing a larger prison population, but also about to be or have been recently released back into society. Now, in many European countries, unfortunately not in Italy, and that's a bit of a pity, but in many European countries, there have been programs that try to de-radicalize individuals in the prison, exactly like they exist for individuals who radicalize outside prison. And there have been remarkable successes. Of course, nothing is perfect. 100% is not a realistic outcome for any de-radicalization program. But inevitably, some individuals will get out and will be still radicalized. And of course, they do pose a security challenge. We have the issue of returnees, people who are coming back from Syria and Iraq, and of course, all the legal and ethical dilemmas that many European countries have had when it comes to having their citizens come back, whether it was opportune or not, legal or not, ethical or not, to bring them back from the battlefield. And that also applies to, of course, children of those who fought there. And then we have little bubbles of sympathy that exist, structures. I have to say, as Professor Lucarelli was saying, one of the main findings of the last 10 years has been that this is a domestic problem. Europe, if not for certain occasional exceptions, does not import jihadism. It produces jihadism. The vast majority of people who carried out attacks in Europe over the last 10 years were people who were born and raised in Europe, or at least had radicalized in Europe. Now, there's a few exceptions. The individual who carried out the attack in Nice last year was somebody who had just arrived with sort of through illegal migration routes in southern Italy and going up to Nice after a few days. But that is an exception. For the vast majority of cases, we're talking about a very much homegrown radicalization and very much of a European problem that Europe exports to other parts of the world. Now, let me close here a bit my comments about jihadism. And of course, this transitory phase is very difficult to say where it will go. The dynamics of the last 40 years, which is give or take how old the jihadist scene in Europe has been, it goes back to the early 80s, is very much dependent on the interaction of two variables. The first one is a domestic one, the presence of pockets of sympathy, bubbles of radicalization. They have always existed in Europe. They increase or decrease in size over time, and they change direction based on the second element, the second variable, which is geopolitical events taking place outside of Europe. So if in the 80s was the war in Afghanistan, in the 90s was Bosnia, in the 2000s was the invasion of Iraq, in the last decade was the conflict in Syria and the declaration of the caliphate in Syria and Iraq. These are the geopolitical events that have made those bubbles of sympathy for jihadism pop up in larger size and take a certain direction. It's obviously very difficult to know whether we're going to see any event like that that will mobilize people in Europe to the same degree. As I said, I don't see any current conflict exercising the same impact, but impossible to predict whether there will be something 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. Let me briefly address the other forms of extremism, and I'm not sure exactly what my time allocation is, so I just don't want to go over time, and please feel free to interrupt me if I go overboard. The other big challenge that European authorities have seen as increasingly of concern is right-wing extremism. Now, in the United States, the dynamic of the last 10 years has been a reversal of the threats, of the threat perception, at least. If 10 years ago, the attention was, I would say, 90% on jihadism and 10% on right-wing extremism, I think we, especially after what happened in Washington on January 6th and the attack on the US Capitol, those percentages have been pretty much de facto reversed, and right-wing extremism is considered by most, and that's generally the assessment of the law enforcement and intelligence community in the United States, the most challenging threat to the U.S. To homeland security in the U.S. Now, in Europe, it might not be the case. And again, I find it at times a bit silly to really have a sort of a challenge. Which one is more? It's not an either-or proposition. But there's no denying that the threat coming from right-wing extremism, from violent right-wing extremism, of course, has increased over the last few years. We've seen a variety of manifestations of it. We've seen a growing internationalization of the scene, which has long manifested itself online, which is where this community really exists in large part on a variety of platforms and social media, but also in the physical space with a relatively large number of people traveling to the Ukraine and Russia to join a variety of groups and militia to obtain fighting skills there and to build sort of an international network of like-minded individuals. We do see growing interaction in the physical space also in Western Europe among these groups. The violent attacks that we have seen coming from this milieu have, for the most part, been by isolated individuals. By isolated individuals, I mean not people who live completely isolated. I mean that from an operational point of view, they acted alone, but they were clearly part of a community of like-minded individuals online and in some cases offline. We just have not seen sort of group dynamics when it comes to violence in right-wing, or at least when it comes to severe violence when it comes to the right-wing scene. Although some dynamics in Germany and in some Scandinavian countries can give pause also from that point of view. The phenomenon of reciprocal radicalization, so the fact that Islamist, jihadist extremism feeds the narrative of right-wing extremism, and vice versa, acts and rhetoric from right-wing militants feed the narrative of Islamists, is something that is extremely of concern. Of course, difficult for authorities to do much about it, but it's clearly the dynamic that we're going to see for the foreseeable future. There are other forms of extremism, of course, that are of concern in Europe. Again, I recommend the Europol report. It's always a very good source. The last minute or so, I guess, that I have, let me just talk briefly about the European response to all this. Now, for the most part, counterterrorism remains the domain of individual member states. Pursuit of terrorists, arrests, convictions, these are all matters that are very much domestic. There is no denying, of course, that we're talking about a very much of a transnational threat. And I think that we have seen some very encouraging results, particularly if we compare to what the state of European counterterrorism cooperation was pre-ISIS-related mobilization. We have really made massive leaps into a better level of coordination. That means both from a formal and informal point of view. Yes, there have been a lot of legal tools that have been put on paper that allow for better information sharing. But in many cases, if you ask any practitioner, what they'll tell you is that a lot of the intelligence sharing and cooperation at the international level has to do, yes, with laws and treaties on paper, but also with informal connections, the feeling that your counterparts in the other country are working on the same page as you, and you can trust them. And I think this is something that has been done quite a bit in terms of creating a variety of structures, at times fairly informal, but that favor information sharing. And I think because of the nature of the threat of the last few years, this has improved significantly. Now, there are, of course, formal structures, and I think Europol, which I mentioned earlier quite a few times, has gone from being a relatively empty shell, and I'm being a bit harsh here, but I think if we're talking about Europol 15 years ago when it came to counterterrorism, I think that's not a completely unfair definition. to a much more operational entity that does solid work in terms of coordination of activities and in terms of taking the lead at times in investigations and, for example, takedowns of extremist profiles online. So Europol has really changed pace from before. In most European countries, I would say the debate is, of course, on the two components of counterterrorism, which are let's call the hard and the soft bits. The hard is the traditional counterterrorism measures, and of course the arrests, monitoring, intelligence gathering, and so on and so forth. And of course the debate is always what's the right balance between the need for security and the need for respecting civil liberties. And every country more or less has the same debate. So of course there are different cultural and constitutional sensibilities in each country. But that's where the debate is, and how much can the state push and deprive individuals of certain rights in the name of collective security. And finally, the other component is the preventive side of things. Most European countries have invested quite a bit of resources in creating activities, structures, programs that seek to prevent radicalization or to de-radicalize, as I was talking about earlier, de-radicalize individuals. It's the idea that you need a balance of the traditional hard tools of counterterrorism with the soft ones, and probably soft is not the right term, but it's commonly used in jargon to describe all these tools in which the traditional actors of counterterrorism, so police and intelligence, work with civil society, with the education system, with religious communities, with families, to try to prevent radicalization. And again, how much to push on that aspect is, of course, some of it is often debated, again, much, but basically that's the dynamic. I hope I didn't go too long. I wasn't sure about the time allocated, but I apologize if I did, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Vidino. This was also very, very interesting, and this roundtable is really very informative and very stimulating in terms of the analysis that have been provided. I will use the time that we have at our disposal to propose the questions that have arrived to the speakers, so all the speakers can come back in the room, in the virtual room, I guess. My suggestion is, given the short time at our disposal at this moment, to propose the questions, probably synthesizing a little bit some of the questions because some are overlapping, and then give you back the floor for your responses. You pick and choose the questions to which you wish to respond. A number of questions regard the vulnerability of the European Union in several realms. In particular, there are a number of questions on the economic vulnerability when we come to high-tech sectors. And here the competition with China is particularly telling. We know that there are a series of very important elements that are necessary for our industries, for car production, for instance, that are produced out of Europe, that imply long chains of supply, and that have made the European countries vulnerable. When we come to high technology, in particular, the technology that then is used in the digital age, and the fact that China has the aim to become the most technological advanced country in the world, and it seems to be in that direction. Here it seems to several of the people that made questions, it seems that really Europe has a problem to face. So in terms of strategic autonomy in the sector of production of high tech in particular, what can the European Union do? And in particular with respect to relations to China, because it's China the main interlocutor. This is also, the attention is also brought by some of the people that ask questions to the implications in terms of relations with China related to the election of Joe Biden, that has probably slightly changed the US attitude towards China, but not in the same direction that Europe is undertaking. Another question that I have to read. Was a technical problem. The question is not there anymore. There was a question by Milad that was addressed to Professor Cottey. Can you please show that, because it's not visible anymore? Then another question is related to COVID and radicalization. So one of the, okay, that's Milad. I complete mine. One of the issues that I frequently underline is or at least I think it's a shareable analysis, is that the social context within which radicalization is more likely are contexts within which there are elements of marginalization, or at least perceived marginalization by the part of the society that radicalizes. And this marginalization might have been made more acute by the COVID-19 that has affected different groups in the society in very different ways. I mean, there are researchers on this, and different impact on different ethnic groups, or whatever you want to call them, different groups. So I was wondering whether you think, Lorenzo, that COVID-19, for not only for its health consequences, but also for the economic consequences that are coming and will come, will also support further radicalization in Europe, in particular in the societies that will not be able to cope with the economic effects. And then to Rosa, something that has to cope precisely with this in relation to Brexit. As far as you know, what is the level of continuation of cooperation among the European countries in a more or less hidden way? As you said, sometimes it's a question of not letting others know with respect to intelligence in these sectors, because it seems to be impossible in a sense that being all members of NATO, Brexit could have made such a bad effect into the already existent and important cooperation in terms of police and intelligence. I would leave it. Oh, well, there was Milad. Can I have back the question by Milad? Because otherwise I keep forgetting that one. Okay, Professor Cottey said that the pandemic has not created new crises, but it has exacerbated existing one. It has also forced our societies to stop, reflect, and start again. I'm thinking the restart of the EU through the Recovery Fund, largely bound to the environmental objective. Could COVID-19 be recognized in the coming years as a turning point, even in a positive one, for the whole series of security crises, starting with the climate, but not only that one? So a lot of questions. I will really give you a short time, please, because unfortunately we have used most of the time. Andrew.
Thanks very much, Sonia, and thanks to the people for the questions. And I've been reading them with interest in the chat as well. I mean, very briefly on the climate and the environment, I think my answer is a simple one. We have to see. At the moment, in my view, in some ways, Europe and the EU tries to lead on climate change, but the gap between some of the rhetoric and the actual kind of climate-related energy and infrastructure and economic transition that we need is still very big. So whether the EU's stimulus program will really be enough to turn things around on the climate thing, I think is for me, the jury's out, is how I would describe it. And then secondly, there were a range of questions on China. There's an awful lot to say, and I'll just try and maybe a few headline points here. One, I suppose there's a very large kind of geopolitical question. How should Europe relate in big picture terms to both China and the US? Should it be equidistant between the two? Should it be closer to one or other, etc.? And that's both a kind of normative question in terms of what one thinks should happen and an empirical question in terms of what is actually happening. My points would be, I think, if you look at what's happened, and if you look at it empirically, if you look at the academic and policy literature on EU and European relations and policy towards China, you see that that policy is shifting pretty rapidly over the past 1 to 2 years. So my view would be that there is a shift away from a basic assumption that China is and can be Europe's partner towards a recognition that the relationship with China is going to be more problematic. And the comprehensive agreement on investment was mentioned by a number of the people in the questions. My view would be that the European shift on that, particularly the fact that the European Parliament has paused consideration of that agreement, is not simply a response to US pressure. It's also a result of a whole range of other things in terms of Xinjiang, Hong Kong, concerns over China's behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic. My broad conclusion is that ultimately Europe will still find that it has much more in common with the United States than it does with a communist-ruled China. There's an awful lot more that could be said here, but I'm conscious we're restricted by time, so I'll stop there. And I'm sure this is something we'll all come back to in future months and years. Thank you.
Rosa, sorry, the floor is yours.
I think what I'll say, I think, runs parallel to what can be said about Europe's relations with the US or Europe's relations with China, in the sense that there is far greater affinity, far greater interconnectedness, and far greater dependency among European states, including Britain, and of course with the US, than there is with any other part of the world, which means that the overarching trend will have to inevitably push the EU and the UK into a dimension of greater cooperation. However, the agreement between the EU and the UK at the moment is very thin, which means that any further cooperation will require complicated and difficult negotiations. And the past 5 years are really testimony to how hard that is, and to how the whole process has become very determined also by politics, ideology, and emotion. So it's going to be very difficult to get there. But, and also in relation to what was said about cyber, there is an inevitable alignment in terms of principles, in terms of policies, in terms of the type of societies that we are, which will force, I think, that level of cooperation. What is going to be hard to imagine is the institutionalized form, because what the British government has been pushing towards is freeing itself from the chains of the European Union. It wants to be nimble, it wants to be agile, it wants to make up its mind as they move along, rather than engage on a platform of permanent negotiation with Brussels. So the form that this cooperation will take is still to be seen, but it's inevitable. I think there's an inevitable drift in that direction because of geopolitical dynamics.
Oh, the mic is always muted. Sorry. Thank you very much, Rosa. And I will pass the floor to Joe.
Thank you, Rosa. Yeah, I mean, I think the forms of cooperation is an important point to extend what Rosa just said. And I guess I tend to think sometimes we get bogged down in this debate whether it's, whether our main focus in the EU should be on US or China. There are other players as well. Let's think about enhancing our cooperation on technology with Japan, with India, with Australia, with New Zealand, leveraging some of these pre-existing platforms for tech cooperation, I think is an agenda for the EU that they're recognizing, and I think is really important. And having some kind of, I think we need to rethink institutional cooperation when it comes to new and emerging technologies, and think about new platforms and mechanisms that we can, embed trust in digital services and digital supply chain. So I think that this is a huge agenda. On the wider question of China, I mean, the questions in the chat were about kind of the inevitability of China becoming, the global leader on technology and AI. And I would treat that with some skepticism. I think China still has some major domestic problems it needs to deal with. Not so long ago, we were talking about regime stability in China. There's, I think, a marked lack of trust globally now in relation to Chinese, lots of Chinese products and services, rightly or wrongly. And I think, the ways that China are using technology domestically, particularly in Xinjiang, has sent, a message to people all around the world that there are real problems with the technology that they're producing and the way they're using it. And I think that, China, are probably already, they're often cited that the highest number of AI journal articles are coming out of China, and that they're really leading in this space. But I'd be a bit skeptical about there being an inevitability about that. And I think there's lots that Europe can do to really kind of nurture and grow our own tech industry in Europe. If you look at the big new European research and development funding through Horizon Europe, lots of stuff in there on cyber, emerging technologies, AI. Look at what Ericsson's doing. It's benefited from the concerns about Huawei and other Chinese providers, and is becoming a really global leader on 5G. And there's no reason that we can't, I think, start to compete and bring more, innovative European companies through the mix. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Lorenzo.
Yes, very briefly, thank you. Very good question about the impact of COVID on radicalization, but I think I'll have to go with Andrew and say we'll see. It's very difficult to tell. Of course, there's a dual impact that the pandemic has had. One is economic, the other one is more psychological, and both of them could have an impact on radicalization. Exactly how it manifests itself, that's very difficult to say. I have to say where so far where we have seen a bigger impact is more in right-wing circles. Right-wing groups, and that's a very complex jungle with different groups, different sub-ideologies, but that space is the space that has utilized everything related to the pandemic, from the anti-lockdown narrative to the conspiracy theories, more than any other extremist ideology. And that has been one of the rallying cries of a variety of groups throughout Europe, as here in the States, to attract more sympathizers. So the sort of anti-vax, anti-lockdown narrative, which has at times led to acts of violence, again, sort of isolated, some of them a bit more like vandalism, attacks against 5G facilities in the Netherlands, this sort of things. When it comes very briefly on the jihadist side, it's complicated, of course, so we hardly have the time to do that now. But the relation between economic issues, disadvantage, and radicalization is contested. And I think a lot of the evidence points to not that to, of course, that being a factor that should not be overlooked, but hardly the driving element that leads to radicalization. So I'm not sure whether then in this context, then the growing hardships that would exist for a lot of people will necessarily be pushed to more radicalization, if not on an isolated level and not necessarily on a large scale.
Thank you very much. It's also very interesting. The last lecture we had in class was on this topic, reading some of the reports. And so it's very interesting to know that, I mean, your view on this, and that is not to be taken as, a fundamental variable to be considered. In fact, we have finished our time, but we have a last question, if I may add one, and profit also a few minutes more of yours, to Professor Balfour, how Britain's internal integrity issue will affect, if at all, the country's relations with the European Union. So we know that this is a hot topic, Scotland in particular.
Yeah, well, Scotland and Northern Ireland are the two difficult issues. And I mean, we know the Brexit project basically is a project of English nationalism that isn't really shared by a majority in the other nations of the Union. But I think from here to imagine a breakup of the UK, it does require some sort of leaps of the imagination. There will be a lot of pressure. I think Northern Ireland, that is more precarious, and we've seen a resumption of violence in April. That is more precarious. We don't know how the two sides are going to negotiate all the difficult issues with respect to the protocol. But there's one more thing I'd like to add to that. So I don't know how this is going to evolve. It's very tricky. But two things. The first is the UK published this integrated review for foreign security, development aid, etc., and it had it was less ideological than all the speeches of the Prime Minister, and it included in between the lines an idea of making investments on Scotland, especially with regard to its nuclear arsenal. So I think the government is aware that it needs to design some more proactive policies to keep the United Kingdom together. The second point about the rest of the EU, I mean, I think, again, I've insisted so much on the fact that this is a very ideological position, because the UK is not particularly interested in having a relationship with the other countries in the European Union. It will speak to Germany and to France, but the rest are in a sort of broader, more peripheral group. And what the UK is really interested in is developing relations with India, with Australia, with the US, with Japan. It wants to prove that it has it can have a global approach to foreign policy. It can have a global vision, and that is the determination to prove this is going to be stronger than a lot of other practical considerations. I mean, if you think that during the negotiations the government did not protect the key economic interests of the UK, such as services sector, it's just an indication of really how ideological this project is. So relations with other parts of Europe are less important than forging a new relationship with India.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And on this, I think we have to hear also Professor Cottey, who is in Ireland. So probably his view is also. Andrew.
Thanks, Sonia. And I should add, people might not know, I'm kind of double-hatted or a good European citizen, because I'm British, but I've lived in Ireland for a number of years. So just a couple of observations. I mean, one, obviously, there was the very recent Scottish Parliament elections, which saw the Scottish National Party effectively re-elected. So, I mean, that's increased the pressure for a second referendum on Scottish independence. Whether we'll see that referendum and when and in what form is an open question. Second thing that's happened as a result of that in the UK is there is kind of an emerging debate on the constitutional future of the UK. So that debate, to my mind, centres around, if the UK is to be a kind of long-term viable state, does it need different constitutional arrangements? Some people are talking about a federal UK. That's certainly not popular on the Conservative Party side, but even on the Conservative Party side, there's kind of a recognition that something needs to be done on the UK's constitution. So that debate is emerging. And then just on Northern Ireland, Brexit has pushed the issue of possible unification with the Republic of Ireland forward. But the recent violence sort of in and around the unionist community has, made people, I think, acutely aware that Irish unification is not something that could be achieved quickly, simply, or easily, or without, a range of complications. So, I mean, my overall conclusion, I think, would be that within the UK, in London, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then outside the UK in the Republic, we're going to see an ongoing debate, and that's going to take quite a lot of kind of political energy and political time in the UK, which will detract from other things like relations with Europe and so on. So, I mean, the kind of the spillover of Brexit, if you like, is going to continue in a whole variety of kind of internal and kind of cross-border contexts for some years to come, I think would be my broad conclusion.
Thank you very much. And it was also an excellent conclusion for what has been an extremely stimulating roundtable. I really wish to thank you all very much for the time and the expertise that you have shared with us. And I look forward to see you in person next time, hopefully in Forlì. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Sonia.
We got the fire.